This is Alex Mercer, broadcasting from Station 9. And tonight, I'm going to tell you about the day everything began. The day the world didn't realize it was already dying. It's strange looking back at the recordings, the reports, the half-corrupted data logs. You see the pattern immediately, like dark veins spreading through a piece of glass. But on that morning, day one, everyone woke up believing it was just another sunrise. People brewed their coffee, kissed their kids, cursed traffic, scrolled their feeds. No one felt the shift, the ripple beneath the surface. No one sensed that something ancient and ravenous had entered the bloodstream of the world. And that ignorance wasn't our mistake. It was the virus's design. At 6:14 a.m., a woman collapsed outside the Ridgestone Metro. The footage, grainy, flickering, tinted by the gray-blue of early morning, shows her leaning against the railing, her body shivering as if caught between two different temperatures. A few commuters pause, glance at her, then move on. A couple of teenagers film her, laughing quietly, mistaking her vacant stare for drunkenness. What none of them saw, not the teens, not the station workers reviewing the tape later, was the way her pupils had completely blown out, swallowing the iris, turning her eyes black as wet coal. They didn't see the faint discoloration threading under her skin, crawling up her neck like bruises forming from the inside out. She was unresponsive for 6 minutes and 14 seconds. When she stood again, her movement was too smooth, too precise, like her joints had reset themselves into something slightly wrong. She didn't wait for help. She didn't look confused or embarrassed. She didn't speak. She just walked into the crowd, and not one person realized what she carried with her. Across the country, at nearly the same time, a farmer in Graymore Valley found half his livestock dead in their pens. He described them as empty, a word I didn't understand until I saw the photos. Their bodies weren't torn, poisoned, or diseased. They were hollow in some unseen way, as if whatever spark keeps a living thing tethered to itself had been quietly stolen in the night. The vet shrugged, filed a vague report, and the farmer burned the corpses before sundown. The smoke drifted across the valley for hours, thick and dark, carrying something the wind should never have touched. Hospitals became the next domino. ERs across several cities admitted patients with conflicting symptoms: high fever but no infection markers, tremors without neurological origins, violent sensitivity to light, even though their eyes showed no damage. CT scans revealed strange neural activity, like electric storms firing in regions of the brain that shouldn't even be active in conscious patients. One nurse reported a patient's blood sample moving in the dish, as if reacting to the air, contracting and expanding like it had a heartbeat of its own. Her supervisor dismissed it as contaminated equipment. The lab machines malfunctioned repeatedly that day, but no one thought to ask why. Airports flagged an unusual number of fainting incidents. Schools sent kids home for unexplained fatigue and nosebleeds. Power grids in several cities flickered at the exact same minute, a coincidence no one questioned. And through it all, the infected walked among us, smiling, talking, shaking hands, breathing in crowded rooms. The virus didn't slow them down. It sharpened them, hid inside them, used them as vessels while it learned us, mapped us, tested the limits of the bodies it had claimed. The first true symptom didn't appear in the sick. It appeared in the machines. Around 8:47 p.m., radios started picking up a low-frequency interference, a pulsing tone, almost like a heartbeat, repeating at irregular intervals. At first, I thought it was atmospheric distortion, maybe a solar flare, but the pattern wasn't natural. It carried structure. It carried intention. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment the infected crossed whatever invisible threshold separates a virus from a presence, from something that could reach beyond flesh. And listen carefully, because this is where I stop the story for tonight. Because day one wasn't an outbreak. It was an infiltration. And what came next wasn't chaos. It was evolution. This is Alex Mercer, broadcasting again from Station 9. And if you're still listening, if your signal hasn't drowned beneath the static that's been crawling across the airwaves since last night, then I need you to hear what happened on day 2. Not the riots, not the evacuations, not the screaming streets you've seen on the news loops. Those came later, much later. What I'm talking about is the quiet shift. The moment hospitals across the country realized something was wrong, deeply, profoundly wrong, and tried to hide it. At dawn, every emergency room in the Eastern District reported unusual overnight admissions. Not an influx, not a surge, something more unnerving. Patients who should have been stable weren't stable at all. People who had been conscious the night before were slipping into something like a waking coma. Others who had been unresponsive were suddenly alert, sitting upright, staring at staff with eyes that didn't blink at the right times, or didn't blink at all. Medical charts became guesswork. Monitors showed readings that didn't match human physiology, heart rates too slow to sustain life, oxygen saturation too high, neural activity patterns that flickered like arrhythmic lightning storms. And while doctors argued over whether this was a new pathogen, a neurological event, or a malfunction of their machines, the patients themselves began to show behaviors no one wanted to document officially. Several nurses reported that their patients were listening to something. Not music, not voices in their head, something external. Some patients tilted their heads in unison, facing the same direction, like dogs hearing a distant whistle. Others pressed their palms to the floor or the walls, as if feeling for vibrations. And all of them, every single one, had the same unnatural dilation of the pupils. Black orbs staring out of human faces like the eyes belonged to something behind the skin. By mid-morning, the first hospital went into temporary lockdown. They cited ventilation trouble, biohazard drills, power grid irregularities. But the truth was less controlled and far more desperate. Several patients had walked out of their rooms without clearance, some disconnecting their own IVs, others simply slipping past staff who swore the patients had been unconscious minutes before. One patient was found standing perfectly still inside a supply closet, facing the corner, unresponsive, breathing slow and steady as if asleep while standing up. Another kept repeating the same phrase over and over. Too late to close the door. Too late to close the door, until his throat bled from the strain. Security footage from the Ridgestone General ICU is perhaps the most disturbing. At 10:32 a.m., every monitor in the ward spiked at the same time. Every machine, every line of vital signs, every cardiac rhythm. 37 patients, different ages, conditions, diagnoses, all synchronized into the same biological pattern for exactly 11 seconds. Doctors would later compare it to a single nervous system shared between multiple bodies. Afterward, several patients began humming. Not a tune, just a single low tone, matching the strange interference frequency that had been haunting radio bands since the night before. Around lunchtime, paramedics began reporting something stranger. No one had called them. For the first time anyone could remember, emergency call volume dropped, sharply, but not because people were getting better. No. The calls stopped because the people who should have been making them weren't able to anymore. Entire apartment complexes seemed unnervingly quiet. Elderly residents who regularly relied on paramedics hadn't phoned for assistance. Accident victims were found wandering the streets instead of calling for help. It was as if a portion of the population had lost the instinct to seek aid and replaced it with something else. By early afternoon, word had spread among medical staff. Nurses whispered about the floor that no one goes into. Doctors snapped at each other behind closed doors, and administrators began receiving frantic emails containing phrases like containment necessary and neurological takeover suspected. But the email that chilled me the most came from a neurosurgeon in Northcrest Memorial. It read, "The virus is not damaging the brain, it is reorganizing it." The message was never sent. It was found in his drafts after he disappeared. Around 3 p.m., the second wave hit, exactly as it had the day before, but stronger, more deliberate. Across several major cities, every electronic device flickered in perfect sync. Security systems rebooted. Cardiac monitors blipped. Radios hissed with the same rhythmic pulse. Elevators froze between floors. Some hospitals recorded magnetic fluctuations strong enough to interfere with surgical instruments. The interference lasted 2 minutes and 23 seconds. And when the hum finally faded, patients across the locked wards began to rise from their beds. This was the moment administrators realized they were outmatched. Medical personnel began barricading rooms with stretchers and oxygen tanks. Some abandoned their posts entirely. Those who stayed described movements from the infected that were calm, careful, almost curious, like they were testing their bodies, testing the world, under new instructions. They didn't attack. They didn't lash out. They simply wandered, observed, listened. And then the worst discovery of the day came in the form of a single lab report slipped under the door of an incident response meeting inside St. Mark's Hospital. A blood sample, taken from a patient who had seemed normal until the moment she collapsed, showed something that didn't resemble a virus at all. Not fungal, not bacterial, not parasitic, not prionic. No membrane, no identifiable structure. Instead, it behaved more like a signal, a waveform, something that encoded itself into the biological systems of the host, rewriting neural pathways like a software update spreading through hardware, a contagion not of flesh, but of communication. And that was when hospitals all across the region, silently and without announcement, began locking their doors. Not to keep the infected in, but to keep whatever was calling to them, whatever they were hearing, out. I'm going to stop here for now, not because the story ends, but because the next part demands more attention than a single broadcast can hold. Day 2 wasn't the collapse of the medical system. It was the moment the virus realized it could spread through more than blood. This is Alex Mercer, still transmitting from Station 9. Though I'll admit, tonight the walls feel too thin, the air too still, and the silence outside too deliberate. Because Day 3 is when the world finally noticed that something was wrong. Not because of screams, not because of chaos, but because for the first time in living memory, the cities went quiet. And not the ordinary kind of quiet. The kind born from snowstorms or late nights or power-saving hours. No. This was the type of quiet that feels intentional, predatory, the kind of hush you hear before something enormous takes its first breath. Day 3 began deceptively ordinary. The sun rose, traffic lights blinked to life. Morning shows played reruns that felt strangely disconnected from reality. News anchors reported localized hospital disturbances and temporary lockouts, carefully avoiding the words outbreak, quarantine, or, God forbid, infection. Authorities insisted everything was under control. They always do in the beginning, but behind that manufactured calm, The cracks were spreading faster than any of them admitted. Cell towers overloaded with silent calls, phones dialing numbers no one had pressed. Power stations experienced simultaneous grid fluctuations across multiple counties. Surveillance cameras caught civilians pausing mid-step on sidewalks and staring upward as if listening to something falling from the sky. By midday, police frequencies began filling with fragmented reports. Unresponsive pedestrians, groups gathering in intersections, individuals refusing commands but showing no aggression. In several cities, officers described crowds forming in complete silence. Dozens of people simply standing shoulder to shoulder, facing the same direction, their heads tilted ever so slightly, as if straining to hear something underground. Some officers approached to disperse them, only for the crowds to break apart and walk away in perfect unison, without looking back. The behavior was unsettling, uncanny in its coordination, but because there was no violence, no overt threat, most departments chalked it up to some bizarre viral trend or mass psychogenic event. They wrote it off because writing things off is easier than confronting the truth. Around 4 p.m., the first power failures rolled across the cities. Not total outages, but brownouts. Lights dimming at the same slow rhythm, refrigerators humming in pulsing waves, traffic signals blinking unpredictably. And then came the worst part. Every electronic device, from phones to radios to hospital equipment, began picking up the same faint tone. A low, thudding pulse, slow, constant, mechanical yet strangely biological, like a heartbeat slamming against the walls of the world. Some people thought it was construction noise. Others blamed generators or distant thunderstorms. But those who heard it directly, the ones sensitive to low-frequency resonance, described a nausea, a dizziness, a vibration behind the eyes, as if something inside their skull was responding to the sound. But the real shift, the one that marked the beginning of the end of normal life, came at dusk. As the sun sank behind the skyline, as shadows thickened between glass towers and empty streets, a sudden stillness rolled across the cities like a tidal wave. The traffic jams that had clogged highways since morning thinned into nothing. Car engines went quiet. Trains halted between stations. Even the wind seemed to die. You could walk outside, stand in the middle of a normally chaotic intersection, and hear nothing except the faint hum of malfunctioning streetlights. At 7:13 p.m., the majority of major metropolitan areas experienced simultaneous communication dropouts. Cell networks collapsed. TV broadcasts cut to static. Emergency channels repeated the same corrupted message on loop, a message no official source has yet claimed responsibility for. Shelter, repeat, shelter. Do not listen to the message always ends the same way. A crackling burst of the same interference tone from day 2. Then people began to disappear. Not in the dramatic, running, screaming way that Hollywood likes to portray. No, the disappearances were subtle, quiet. Individuals were last seen stepping outside to check the breaker, or look for the neighbors, or see if the power was out on the next street. They walked into the dusk and never came back. No screams, no rescues, no alarms. Their homes remained untouched. Dinner on the stove, lights still on, television still playing frozen emergency messages. In some neighborhoods, entire households vanished in under an hour, leaving behind only warm plates, overturned chairs, or doors left slightly ajar. Security cameras caught glimpses of what happened next. Grainy footage, but enough to form a pattern. People who had wandered into the streets didn't run. They didn't flail or resist. They walked toward dark alleyways, toward sewer grates, toward underpasses, as if something underground was pulling at them, calling them, and every one of them moved with the same slow, measured steps, as if answering a signal. By 9 p.m., the cities had transformed into something unrecognizable. Roads stood empty, windows were dark, elevators hung motionless in their shafts. Parks were deserted, swings creaking in the still air though no wind blew. Even animals fell silent. No dogs barking, no birds calling from rooftops. Just the pulse. That low, distant, inescapable vibration humming beneath the concrete, whispering through pipes, rattling metal signs. And I need to make this clear. The infected weren't attacking yet. They weren't hunting or feeding or chasing. They were simply assembling, reorganizing, waiting. The virus wasn't acting like an illness. It was behaving like an intelligence, repositioning its hosts into places and patterns that made no sense to us, not then. Some survivors described seeing figures standing on rooftops, perfectly still, silhouetted against the dying sky. Others swore they saw shapes in the fog rising from drainage vents, shapes that were too tall, too thin, too patient to be human. And when the fog rolled deeper into the streets, swallowing entire blocks in a cold, wet haze, even the bravest citizens locked their doors and prayed for morning. But here's the part I didn't know until I recovered a corrupted emergency broadcast from the Westline district. At exactly 11:42 p.m., seismographs across the region recorded something impossible. A tremor that didn't originate in the earth below, but in the structures above. The cities themselves vibrated. Every building, every bridge, every steel beam, as if some invisible frequency was traveling through the infrastructure like an infection spreading through veins. Not long after that, the remaining street cameras captured one final image before the blackout. Dozens of infected individuals stepping into the roads, turning their faces upward toward the sky, their mouths open in unison, as if chanting something too low for microphones to capture. And then, silence. Everything shut down. Every feed, every light, every signal. That was the first night the cities went quiet. Not a natural quiet. Not a peaceful quiet. A waiting quiet. A listening quiet. The quiet before the dead started to wake up with purpose. I'll continue this in the next broadcast, because day four is when they made the first move. This is Alex Mercer, broadcasting once again from Station 9, and tonight I'm going to tell you about day 4, because this is the day everything stopped hiding. If day 1 was the whisper, day 2 the warning, and day 3 the silence, then day 4 was the moment the world finally understood what had crawled into its blood. Not because of a single event, but because the virus, whatever intelligence governs it, decided it no longer needed to remain subtle. It had learned enough. It had gathered enough. It had prepared enough. And on the 4th day, it began to test its new limbs, pulling the dead upright with a patience that felt older than civilization itself. The morning started with false hope. Power returned in scattered neighborhoods, flickering like dying candles in the vast darkness that had swallowed the cities. Radios hummed back to life, distorted but alive. People peeked through their curtains, squinting into streets that were empty but illuminated by the weak glow of emergency lighting. Some believed the worst had passed. Others tried to call their families or check the news, but nothing connected. No networks, no signals, just dead screens and static-filled channels. And beneath that static, if you listened closely enough, you could hear it. The faint rhythmic pulse that had haunted us since the beginning. Quieter now, but more deliberate, like something breathing slowly in the dark, content with what it had become. By afternoon, the first bodies were found. Not fresh victims, but those who had disappeared during the blackout of day 3. They were discovered in strange places, curled at the bottoms of stairwells, lying along the edges of drainage systems, huddled in maintenance tunnels, as if they had been drawn underground in their final moments. Yet none of them looked like they had died in panic. Their faces were peaceful. Their bodies showed no signs of struggle, no injuries, no disease except one unnerving detail. Every corpse had faint black lines beneath their skin, tracing along their veins like someone had drawn a map of the body in ink. Doctors who later examined the remains insisted the marks weren't infections or bruises. They were patterns, organized, intentional. Some bodies had lines spiraling outward from the heart. Others showed symmetrical branching across the limbs and neck. Almost like the virus had left signatures, each unique, etched into its hosts before abandoning them. But the real terror began as daylight faded. That evening, the temperature dropped abruptly, sharp enough to fog windows and fill the air with a thin, pale mist that rolled across the streets. It carried a metallic scent, almost like cold iron, and with it came an unsettling phenomenon. The city lights flickered in unison, not in the stuttering way of faulty power systems, but with a rhythm, a slow, repeating dim and rise, dim and rise. Residents who stepped outside reported hearing faint shuffling beneath the streets, like thousands of footsteps moving through underground corridors. Sewers vibrated, manholes rattled, bridges hummed softly as if something massive was passing beneath them. Security footage, what little survived, captures the moment around 7:46 p.m. when the first corpse stood up. A body bag on a gurney inside the Westline Hospital morgue twitched once, then again, then began to rise with slow, mechanical precision. Not convulsing, not spasming, rising. Its joints moved stiffly, like a puppet pulled upright by invisible wires. There was no breathing, no heartbeat, no flicker of awareness. The movement was purely functional, an empty shell responding to a command. Minutes later, other bodies began to rise in the same methodical fashion, staggering to their feet in a quiet, almost ceremonial procession. Morgue doors opened. Hallway lights flickered as the newly animated corpses walked with heavy, deliberate steps toward the exit. Not chaotic, not frenzied. Purposeful. Across the city, similar events were unfolding. Corpses in funeral homes shifted under their sheets. Bodies in abandoned cars stirred after hours of stillness. In some neighborhoods, people recorded thumping sounds coming from basements where victims from day 2 had been stored temporarily. Those who investigated described the same sight, the dead rising slowly, as if they were relearning gravity, and all of them, every single one, moved toward the same direction, not toward the living, not toward sound or light, but toward the horizon, where the mist thickened into a white wall swallowing the outer districts. Around 9 p.m., the mist began to move, flowing between buildings like a living thing. Street cameras caught glimpses of silhouettes inside it, tall, rigid shapes that didn't belong to any human body. Some were slender like twisted columns, others hunched like bent metal frames, and a few stretched unnaturally tall, brushing against balconies and signage as they passed. The dead followed them, not closely, not crawling or grasping, but trailing like loyal shadows drawn toward a beacon only they could sense. Whatever walked within that fog wasn't walking alone. It was guiding. Survivors who witnessed the procession from rooftops described it as a migration, a pilgrimage, an evacuation of the dead. Some ran, some hid, some simply froze, unable to comprehend the sight of hundreds of bodies moving with synchronized purpose. And as they passed, electronic devices began to malfunction again, Lights buzzing, radios squealing with distortion, car alarms dying mid-blare. The virus wasn't just in the bodies now. It was in the infrastructure, riding the frequencies, embedding itself into circuits and signals like a digital haunting. At 11:12 p.m., the dead stopped moving. Every corpse, whether in the streets, on sidewalks, or emerging from alleyways, froze in place as if listening. Silence drowned the city, and then, in perfect unison, they turned their heads upward. Witnesses reported seeing their jaws twitch open slightly, teeth clenching rhythmically like they were speaking without sound. A few seconds later, the sky echoed with a low, resonant pulse, the same frequency from days 2 and 3, but deeper now, stronger, as if it were no longer a broadcast, but a voice. The pulse vibrated through windows, rippled puddles, shook loose debris from rooftops, and the dead responded by taking a single step forward, one long, synchronized step. That was the moment we knew. The virus wasn't guiding them blindly. It wasn't manipulating corpses like tools. It was communicating, directly, clearly, with intention. And whatever message it delivered that night, whatever command it issued through the pulse, it was only the beginning, because day 4 didn't end with the dead walking. It ended with them listening. And on day 5, they stopped following the fog and started following us. This is Alex Mercer, broadcasting through a signal that feels thinner every night, like I'm speaking through a thread stretched too tight over an abyss. If you're hearing this, then you're one of the few still tuned into the world as it is, not as it pretends to be. And tonight, I need to tell you about day 5, because this is the day the dead stopped wandering. This is the day they stopped listening to whatever moves in the fog and started listening for us. Day 5 is when the dead, whatever they had become, began to track the living with a focus so cold, so precise it felt less like instinct and more like strategy. Morning came late on day 5. The sky swallowed by a heavy gray veil that muted the sun into a pale, sickly disk. Survivors reported waking not to light, but to a strange vibration creeping through the floors, like distant footsteps felt through concrete. Radios were nearly useless, filled with static patterns that pulsed slowly, beating in a rhythm too steady to be random. The mist from the night before clung to the streets, drifting through alleys and piling in low pockets around buildings like it was searching for places to hide. And beneath that mist, the dead stood frozen exactly where they had stopped the night before, silent, rigid, facing the same direction. Dozens of them lined sidewalks and intersections, their bodies stiff and unmoving, like statues left behind in a city abandoned by time. At first, survivors thought the dead had gone dormant. Some dared to creep past them, testing the stillness. They spoke in whispers, held their breath, tiptoed across cracked pavement, believing the nightmare had paused. But the dead weren't dormant. They were waiting, observing, listening for something only the living could produce. Because that morning, for reasons we still don't understand, the virus altered its method. Instead of calling to them from the fog, it taught them how to detect us. The first sign came from a group sheltering inside a grocery store in the Ridgestone district. They had barricaded themselves behind doors and shelves, using plastic bins to collect rainwater leaking through the roof. For hours, the dead outside had remained motionless, their heads slightly tilted upward. But when one of the survivors dropped a can, just a single metallic clatter echoing across the empty aisle, the nearest corpse rotated its head toward the building with a slow, unnatural smoothness. Not a twitch, not a snap, a controlled turn, like a camera lens finding its target. Within seconds, Every corpse in the street turned to face the store. Moments later, they began to move. Not stumbling, not dragging, but walking with steady, deliberate steps toward the source of the sound. Not toward the building in general, toward the exact section where the can had fallen. Reports from across the region began pouring in. Stories of the dead pivoting their heads in perfect synchronization at the faintest noise. A survivor coughed inside a parked car. 5 corpses turned and approached with a slow, relentless certainty. Someone tried to start a generator 3 blocks away. Within minutes, the dead began forming a loose semicircle around the alley where the engine had sputtered, their bodies adjusting, as if strategizing, probing for entry points. They no longer moved aimlessly. They no longer followed fog or shadow. They were hunting, patiently, methodically, and they had all the time in the world. By afternoon, survivors discovered something even more disturbing. The dead weren't reacting to sound alone. They were responding to electrical signals. A woman hiding inside an apartment reported that whenever she turned on her phone screen, even at the lowest brightness, the dead in the street below would shift their posture, their heads angling toward her window with eerie precision. The faint electricity from the device was enough to alert them, like sharks sensing blood in water. Radios emitted faint bursts of interference whenever they were near. Even unplugged appliances, if they held residual charge, seemed to attract the infected like beacons. The virus had given them a new sense, one designed to detect the living not by sight, but by the tiny electrical signatures our bodies and devices naturally produce. Around sunset, the mist began to thin, revealing the full scale of what the dead had been doing. They had spread themselves across the city in a pattern, an enormous grid, spacing themselves evenly across streets, rooftops, courtyards, open lots. Survivors who climbed high enough to see the layout described it as a net, a human net. The dead had positioned themselves at intervals designed to detect any disturbance, any movement, any spark of electricity. They were mapping us, herding us, closing the gaps. And then, sometime after dark, the virus showed its newest trick. Bodies that had been motionless for hours began communicating, not in words or growls or anything vocal, but through synchronized movement. One corpse would tilt its head. A few seconds later, another would mirror the gesture blocks away. Some raised their arms, others crouched. Some simply shifted their footing. But regardless of the motion, each gesture was repeated across the grid, passing from one corpse to the next, like a signal traveling down a line of antennas. Whatever intelligence controlled them was coordinating them across the entire city, using dead bodies the way a conductor uses an orchestra. Each movement, a note in a silent symphony. When one survivor tried to run across an open intersection, the entire grid reacted. Corpses 3 blocks away began adjusting, pivoting, moving into flanking positions. Those closest to him didn't sprint. They simply closed in with steady, efficient steps, driving him toward a dead-end alley as if anticipating his movements before he made them. He was never seen again. The next day, that alley contained fresh footprints leading into a storm drain grate pried open from below. The most terrifying discovery came just before midnight. A group hiding inside an old radio station tried to send a distress signal, just a short broadcast on a low-frequency band. They didn't even make it through the full transmission before the dead outside reacted. Every corpse within 5 blocks snapped its head toward the building simultaneously, like a switch had been thrown. The survivors watching from the second floor said they moved as one, converging on the station with a unity that suggested not instinct, not hunger, but purpose. The group shut the signal off immediately and went silent. The dead froze, stood still for a moment, and then, slowly, they turned their heads left and right, searching, feeling, sensing through walls. Within minutes, the building was surrounded. The survivors waited in silence for hours, terrified to move. But what happened next was worse than any attack. The dead lost interest. Not because the survivors escaped detection, but because the grid had somewhere else to go. One by one, the corpses broke away and walked toward the center of the city, toward a low, pulsing hum rising from beneath the streets, a hum that had grown louder that night, resonating through concrete, causing loose metal to shiver and windows to hum with vibration. That was the moment we realized the truth. The virus wasn't evolving randomly. It wasn't improvising. It was coordinating. And the dead weren't tracking the living for feeding or infection. They were collecting us, herding us, locating every last source of electrical activity until the map was complete. Day 5 ended with a chilling fact. The dead had stopped listening for the fog. They were listening for us, and whatever they were preparing for had not yet begun. This is Alex Mercer, and if you're listening, then the grid of the dead hasn't found you yet. Keep your devices shielded, keep movement slow, keep breathing quieter than the room around you. Tonight, I'm going to tell you what happened on day 6, what really happened during the first attempted evacuation. Not the official version, not the garbled rumors spreading through abandoned channels, but the truth dug out of scattered recordings, and the memories of the broken survivors who made it out. Day 6 wasn't just another day of running or hiding. It was the first day humanity tried to push back, and the day something beneath the earth answered. By dawn, survivor groups across 5 districts had heard a faint but coherent broadcast. It cut through the static like a sliver of sunlight through storm clouds. A woman's voice, calm, professional, clearly pre-recorded, announced that a convoy of armored transports would be arriving at Sector Delta's northern overpass at exactly 9 o'clock. She gave coordinates, evacuation procedures, and the promise of safe transport to a fortified zone outside the quarantine perimeter. I've listened to that recording a dozen times. There was no distortion, no panic, no clues of deception. Whoever sent it knew survivors would risk everything to reach those coordinates. Hundreds began moving before sunrise. Some crept through alley shadows, sticking close to walls where the dead stood in their silent grid. Others moved across rooftops, careful to avoid loose gravel that might give them away. A few used abandoned sewer tunnels, dark, narrow, slick with condensation, to avoid the open streets. But all of them noticed something strange as they traveled. The dead were standing further apart that morning, as if slowly stretching the grid wider. Their heads turned in small, jerking increments, as if they were recalibrating some invisible map. Survivors described it as passing through a field of human antennae, every corpse tuned to a signal humming beneath the city. As they reached the overpass, they saw the convoy, 4 vehicles, military-grade transports armored with thick plating, engines idling with a steady diesel beat. The sun cut a slanted glow across them, lighting their steel surfaces like beacons of hope. Soldiers waved survivors forward, voices sharp but supportive. The scene almost seemed normal, organized, human. For a moment, people cried, not out of fear but in relief. They had made it. Help had come. The first transport filled quickly. Families clung to one another. Strangers held hands. A child tucked beneath her father's coat whispered that the nightmare was finally ending. Engineers inspected the trucks, confirming shielding, fuel levels, engine health. But one detail was off. A survivor, a former mechanic, noticed the engines weren't emitting any of the usual electrical interference. No dashboard flicker, no hum from the alternators, no shortwave noise. At the time, he thought nothing of it, but later, he said it felt like the trucks were ghosts wearing metal skins. As the transports prepared to depart, something shifted. Birds, those few still alive, shot into the sky from trees half a mile away, spiraling in frantic circles before vanishing into the clouds. The dead, scattered across nearby streets, turned their heads simultaneously toward the overpass. Slowly, smoothly, with terrifying coordination. Survivors froze. Soldiers raised their rifles. Radios crackled with sudden interference. A low-frequency vibration rolled across the pavement, rattling bolts and trembling guardrails. Then the ground groaned. Every survivor present described the same sound, like metal bending under a giant weight, like a massive door being dragged open beneath the earth. The asphalt trembled. Dust lifted from the cracks in tiny clouds. Something deep below them was waking, activating, listening. The lead transport revved its engine and lurched forward. That movement, however small, was enough. The dead began to converge, not running, not staggering, walking with that same steady, calculating pace they'd shown the day before, forming lines, cutting off exits, closing gaps like living walls. Soldiers fired warning shots into the air. The infected didn't flinch. A second transport attempted to reverse, but its tires locked, as if something beneath the pavement were gripping them. Then the overpass buckled. A 3-meter section of road cracked open like a splitting spine, tossing debris into the air. People screamed, soldiers stumbled. A few survivors fell straight into the widening fissure, vanishing without a sound. Swallowed by dust and darkness, the bridge shuddered violently, steel beams bending with horrifying ease. And then, it emerged. Not a creature in the traditional sense, not a single shape. It rose as a mass, something shifting beneath a skin of broken concrete and rebar. Thousands of tendrils, thin as wires and thick as pillars, pushed upward, writhing and intertwining like roots crawling out of the earth. They weren't plant. They weren't machine. They weren't flesh. They were something in between, coated in a slick gray substance like half-dried resin. They moved with slow intelligence, like they were feeling the air, tasting it. One tendril reached the underside of a transport and wrapped itself around the axle, tightening with a low mechanical flex. The metal bent like clay. Another reached the hood and slid beneath the engine compartment, probing, searching, until the transport's remaining lights flickered out. It didn't simply crush machines. It drained them. The soldiers opened fire. Bullets punctured the tendrils, but instead of bleeding, the impacts rippled across their surfaces like disturbances in liquid metal. The thing reacted, not with pain, but with awareness. Its tendrils lifted, curled, and extended toward the sound of gunfire with frightening precision. A soldier screamed as a tendril wrapped around his leg and pulled him from the ground. Not upward, down, down into the crack it had opened, dragging him into the darkness without a shred of resistance. His rifle clattered to the asphalt and fell silent. The dead arrived next, lining the edges of the bridge, watching, almost waiting. They didn't attack. They observed the thing rising from below like worshippers watching an ancient idol. The convoy commander ordered a retreat. Engines roared, real engines this time, and the remaining transports accelerated toward the ramp. But the thing below adapted. Tendrils whipped up, slamming across the pavement like steel cables. One transport flipped end over end, smashing into the guardrail and tumbling off the side of the overpass in a plume of dust. The second managed to break through, its tires screaming, sparks lighting the air as metal scraped metal. Survivors clung to it, some hanging out the open doors, others sprinting behind as the bridge collapsed in stages. By the time the survivors reached open ground, the dead had resumed their grid. The tremors faded, the crack sealed part way, just enough to hide the thing below. And the convoy broadcast signal stopped. Only one transport escaped that day. It carried 23 survivors, some injured, some silent from shock. Every one of them said the same thing. The evacuation had never been meant to succeed. Someone, or something, wanted them gathered, concentrated, predictable. Day 6 taught us one truth no one wanted to accept. The dead weren't the real threat. They were the surface-level symptom, the thing beneath the earth, the thing that listened, learned, and reached, is the heart of the infection. And after day 6, it wasn't hiding anymore. This is Alex Mercer, broadcasting through a night that feels heavier than any before it. If you're hearing this, then either the dead haven't mapped your position yet, or something else is keeping them occupied tonight. Day 7 was different. Not because of what the dead did on the ground, or what the thing beneath the city learned, but because of what appeared above us, high in the sky, silent and watching, as if the infection we've been fighting wasn't the beginning of the story, but the middle. And whatever stands behind it finally decided to look in our direction. Most survivors described day 7 as the first day the world felt artificially still, as though the earth were holding its breath. The morning began with an unnatural quiet, one that swallowed even the faint background noises we've grown used to. The wind brushing through broken windows, distant groans from the dead, the soft clatter of debris shifting across abandoned streets. It was all gone. People woke to a silence so complete it felt like a weight pressing against their skulls. Those hiding indoors described their ears popping just from sitting up. Some said it felt like walking underwater. Others said it was like the air had been replaced with something thicker, something that wasn't quite air at all. And the dead were motionless, not in their grid this time, not scanning or recalibrating. They stood frozen in positions that made no pattern, as though the intelligence that guided them had paused, like a machine waiting for new instructions. Survivors from the South District reported corpses standing mid-step, arms raised, backs arched slightly, as if caught in the middle of adjusting their sensory posture when the signal controlling them simply stopped. On any other day, people might have taken advantage of the stillness, rushed supplies, moved between sectors, even attempted escape. But no one dared to move. Everyone felt something was wrong, something enormous, something watching. The first sign came at 11:14 a.m. A sound, a deep, resonant hum, rolled across the city from above. Not loud at first, but steady, vibrating through glass, metal, bones. Not a mechanical sound, not wind. It was a frequency, a tone that felt too perfectly tuned to be natural. Dogs, those few still wandering feral, bolted for cover. Birds took to the air in massive, disorganized flocks. Even the dead reacted to the sound, their heads slowly tilting upward in unison, eyes hollow and unblinking. Faces turned toward the sky like believers awaiting revelation. None of us saw it at first. The clouds were thick and unmoving, hanging low like a heavy ceiling. But then the sky changed. The clouds didn't part. They moved aside, rolled back in a slow, circular pattern, like the sky was peeling itself open layer by layer. Through that widening gap, survivors saw something impossible. A massive circular distortion, not an object exactly, but a shape of light and shadow bending the air itself. Some described it as a ripple, like heat above asphalt. Others said it looked like the sky was dented inward, pulled toward something invisible. But all agreed on one detail. It was big enough to cover an entire district. As the distortion stabilized, the hum deepened. The dead responded instantly. They lowered themselves into a kneeling position, arms hanging limply at their sides, heads bowed. Every corpse in the city, tens of thousands, kneeling in perfect synchronization. Survivors watching from rooftops described the sight as a field of broken statues praying to something we couldn't see. Whatever intelligence commanded them had shifted its focus upward, toward the thing forming in the sky. The distortion grew darker, its edges swirling with strands of shimmering light, soft, pulsing waves of color that resembled auroras twisted into spirals. The center, however, remained an abyss, a void, so black it seemed to swallow the daylight around it. Some said it felt alive. Others said it felt ancient. A few whispered that it wasn't arriving, it was waking. At 11:27 a.m., the distortion released a pulse, an expanding ring of air so powerful it knocked birds out of the sky and shattered windows across 3 districts. But it wasn't a weapon. It was a scan, a detection wave, every device still functioning. Phones, radios, generators, even simple battery-powered lanterns flickered violently. Some sparked, some died altogether. Others rebooted with distorted screens displaying symbols no one could decipher. It was searching for something, measuring something, counting something, and the dead responded to the pulse. Their bodies tensed, their spines straightened, and their heads snapped upward. Every corpse raised its face toward the sky, jaw slack, eyes wide, as though receiving a silent command. Survivors hiding indoors felt a pressure behind their eyes, a tingling sensation crawling down their necks like static electricity. One woman reported her vision blurring into streaks of white whenever she looked at the distortion, as if her mind itself were rejecting the sight. Then came the voices, not human voices, not language. A layered resonance, deep, metallic, harmonic, echoed across the rooftops, vibrating in chests and walls like the sound of enormous metal plates grinding against one another. It wasn't speaking to us. It was speaking to the dead, sending instructions, updating the grid, rewriting them. At 11:32 a.m., something new happened. The dead stood, not staggered, not jolted. They rose in one fluid movement, spines unfolding like puppets pulled by invisible strings. Their heads turned toward the same direction, the outskirts of the city, where the mountains rise like jagged teeth against the horizon. Survivors watching from high vantage points said the dead looked alert, ready, as if preparing for a march. And then the distortion reacted to something on the ground. It pulsed again, sharper this time, like a flare of electricity. Survivors in the North District saw a column of fog rise from between the buildings, spiraling upward in a thin, twisting rope straight into the sky. It wasn't smoke. It wasn't steam. It was the same mist we've been seeing since the first outbreak, dense, gray, swirling with tiny sparks of static. The distortion responded, flaring with brighter color, almost welcoming it. And that's when the impossible happened. The mist didn't just rise. It lifted bodies with it. Corpses, 20, 30, more, rose slowly into the air, as if gravity had loosened its grip on them. Their limbs dangled, their heads rolled back, their chests opened slightly, ribs separating like petals parting. The distortion absorbed them, pulling them upward until they vanished into its swirling center like dust drawn into a vortex. Not consumed, taken, collected, As the last bodies disappeared, the distortion contracted, folding in on itself like a pupil narrowing in bright light. The aurora-like strands collapsed, turning inward with a soft flicker. Within seconds, the sky rippled once more, as though someone had wiped their hand across the surface of a lake. Then it was gone. The clouds sealed shut. The hum faded into silence. The dead resumed their grid positions without hesitation, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But every survivor who saw that sky, everyone who felt that frequency vibrating through their bones, described one last detail. When the distortion vanished, they felt watched, evaluated, not just by the dead, not by the mist, not by the thing beneath the earth, but by something above us, something vast, something aware, something waiting. Day 7 wasn't about the dead learning. It was about the sky taking, collecting, sampling, observing. Whatever this infection is, it isn't local, it isn't biological, it isn't accidental. It's a signal, system,